Well, hello everyone. I thought this was a good front slide to commemorate our Laneways walk that we did last week. And what we're going to talk about today is we're going to extend our discussions about image design and the components within your image that contribute to the narrative and the aesthetic of the image as you're composing it. Because we can all be standing at the same place, and we've seen that everybody ends up with different images, and some are absolutely amazing and some are just a photograph. But it's what people choose to actually include within their image and how they place them that makes their image much more powerful. And we're going to discuss the concept of ensuring that you communicate to your viewer the proportion and scale of the different elements within the image. Over the next few weeks, we'll be talking about a lot of these elements of design. And we've already discussed the white negative space, but we're going to explore texture and colour and tone and how each of these contributes to the narrative and the emotion within your image. And so today we're doing proportion. So just ensuring that you make the appropriate choices of how to communicate what you're trying to communicate to the viewer from your image. So when we talk about scale, what it means is that we're providing a frame of reference for the viewer for each of the different elements within the image. And it's that comparative size of each one of these elements. If we just see something by itself within an image, we often have no concept of how big it is. And this is something that when you'll see product manufacturers, if they're trying to communicate that a phone is really tiny, then they put it with something that people know, like someone's hand. And that then allows you to have some idea on how big that new mini phone actually is. So it's something that we're often unaware of that we're being communicated to, but if you're consciously trying to design an image to make it have a wow factor, then it's something you need to think about. So the sense of scale affects the meaning, tone, and the entire composition of your design, and it's something that you need to be conscious of when you're actually taking the image. It also can provide a visual path through your image, and we've alluded to this concept of images having a visual path, and that if we don't provide a coherent and intelligible visual path, then the viewers will often pop out the side of our frame because we haven't given them a path to keep coming back into the image. And our visual hierarchy is created by the comparative size of each of the elements within our image. And so it allows the viewer's eye to follow around these elements, and their comparative size gives them perspective and proportion, and also provides a narrative to inform the viewer about what we're expecting them to look at, in what order, and what's most important. And size can do that. So if two elements are of the same size, then it invokes the viewer to think about similarities between them. If the two elements are different sizes, and those different sizes don't make sense to us because we know that those two things are usually the same size, then it creates a tension and an intrigue of why are those two things different sizes. And if they're scaled realistically, then it gives us or the viewer a structure and order for that visual path. So the way that we can communicate scale is typically by using reference objects, but we'll also have a look at, depending on our point of view, our vantage point of taking that particular scenario, our lens choice, and our use of leading lines, we can also communicate this concept of depth and scale. So the best way of using reference objects is using reference objects of known size. So things like a person's hand next to a mobile phone indicates immediately how big that mobile phone is, because we all know how big an adult human hand is. So we'll have a look at each of these things and see not only do they contribute scale, but they also allow, particularly for people, animals and plants, a personal connection between the viewer and an object within the image. So it immediately gives the viewer something for their eye to land on. And I've often spoken about this as being an important component of an image, is allowing the viewer to have a visual path through the image, but also being able to land on a spot and rest there. And often it's these reference objects that enable the viewer to do that, as well as those reference objects providing this concept of scale. When there's no reference objects, we have no concept of scale. And these are two photographs that I took when we did our laneways tour last week. And you can see they're nice images graphically, but you have no idea whether I took it with a macro lens or whether I took it with a wide angle lens. And in actual fact, both of these images are massively huge. At least, I don't know, 10 meters by 10 meters. But there's no way of knowing that without any sort of reference point for them. So that's why sometimes we deliberately leave out reference objects to confuse and intrigue the viewer. But if we really want to communicate something about this scene, then we need to put some reference objects in. And so the one on the left here is the Freedom Tower in Tehran, and it was absolutely massive. Beautiful, beautiful architecture. And I wanted to be able to communicate how big it is, because without that person in front of it, you'd have no idea what I photographed, because prior to going to Tehran, I had never seen this particular piece of architecture, so it wasn't something familiar like the Eiffel Tower. But by putting that person in front of it, you immediately get an idea of how big it is. And it also allows us to land on that person and then go up those lines into that tower. The other important thing is when you are putting people in images is, and using them as a silhouette like this, because this obviously is not a portrait of this person, it's just I'm using them as a reference image, is to try and get their limbs separated. Very hard to do at a distance, but you just have to wait for the ideal time of where they actually positioned. And I tried to get him sort of between two of those lines and to get them walking, and ideally with their hands out. So that way the viewer doesn't just see a black blob and tries to work out what that scar on the landscape is. They can actually immediately see, just because of the shape of that person, that it is in fact a person. And this one on the right here was again in Iran, and trying to communicate how high this particular building was, and how difficult it was to get up there. It's actually part of the it's a very ancient religion where they take their dead up into a tower and allow them to be eaten by crows. They don't bury their dead. And this is the tower they take them up to. So you can see there is a long procession up there. And that's what I was trying to communicate by using the people as a reference point. Now, within this and both of these images, you can see I've used a lot of the concepts that we've used in the past about design, about using lines, about using shapes, about using frames within frames. All of these things come together. So all of these elements of good design that I'm teaching you are elements that contribute to an amazing image that you go, wow. So they're not things that you use in isolation. All of these things have to work together. And again, in both of these, I wanted to communicate the size of the area or the building that I was trying to visually communicate to the viewer. And I've used silhouettes of people so that you get that impression of how big each of those spaces are. Sometimes we mix up the relative size of known subjects within our image, and we do that for creative purposes and to add intrigue. And so it immediately makes the viewer dive into the image and ask the question why. And having an intrigue and a narrative to an image, we've talked about as being a very strong element. The narrative, the aesthetics, and the timing are the three things that make an image much more interesting. We can also use animals, and animals are more natural elements in landscapes. What I failed to say before was that novice photographers tend to wait until everybody is out of their image before they take a photograph. And what photography has learnt or taught me is that it's much more interesting if there is a person in there. You just have to get the right person at the right place and the right silhouette, and it adds so much more to it. But typically in landscapes, if it's nature, we're not looking for people to be in it because they don't belong there. And so often animals and wildlife belong within the area that we're actually photographing, and they provide a more natural reference size. And so you can see in this bottom right-hand one, I was absolutely awed by the size, that the sky was absolutely beautiful, and by the width of the beach. And so to be able to get that sense of scale and that awe, I needed some reference objects in it. And camels are pretty large animals, but you can see how they're completely overwhelmed by this landscape. Not only do they provide, by including animals and wildlife within an image, not only do they add scale and enable the proportions to be worked out by the viewer, but they also add an aesthetic, because we make it this human connection to animals within a landscape. And so you get that an added layer of emotion within that narrative, and you also get an aesthetic that people like looking at animals, not so much silhouettes of humans, but they dive into the image. And so trying to, if you've got something that you think looks amazing, see if you can incorporate some of these extra elements in it to make it look even more amazing. So reference objects, we talked about animals, people, and wildlife. The other thing is trees. We all have a relative idea of how big trees are, and so it allows the viewer to have some idea of the scope of the landscape. And you can see in this top left-hand side one, not only have I included trees, but I've tried to capture the wildlife as well. And both of those things give something for the viewer to rest their eye on. And it's a matter of trying to get them positioned in the image in an aesthetic way. If we haven't got animals or people, then other things that we can use to give scale are man-made structures and things that we know the relative scale of. And the image below, I wanted to give the scale of these clouds, these ominous storm clouds that were massing over Sydney Harbour. And so the best way to get a concept of scale is the massive Sydney Harbour Bridge is miniaturised, as are the buildings in Sydney, by these clouds. So that gives that sense of scale. And the same as the one up top, I was trying to give an idea of the clouds and the sky and the sunrise, and those little dots in the background there are boats. So it allows the viewer to get that sense of scale. The one on the bottom here was the Tasmanian landscape. This little building is just dwarfed by, in this case, I was trying to get an image of the scale of the drought within Tasmania and how it had impacted their landscape. And the one on the left is the lighthouse, which we all know lighthouses are huge. But I was trying to give a depth of how far away that lighthouse was by layering the landscape and getting a foreground, midground and background. So not only can we use reference objects to get a sense of scale, we can also use our point of view or vantage point. And you can see this is the same image, the left and right. I took it at the Spotswood sewage works we went to a few weeks ago, and it was an old tin shed out the back. The one on the left is just a straight on standard shot of that tin shed wall. I love the textures and the colours within the wall, but by shooting, I got down low and very close and shot with a wide angle lens up. So we get a lot of those leading lines, but it also gives a sense of power and height and a completely different emotional feel by using that vantage point. So depending on the vantage point, we can give a different perspective of scale. And this again was at the sewage works, where I shot the administration buildings from above, and it diminishes their size. They were quite large buildings, and when you were down in that courtyard and looked up, they were massive. And so the one on the right is from below to give that feeling of height and grandeur and power. And so you can see how much emotion is actually embedded in that vantage point, and by using the scale, how that actually adds to the narrative and the emotion that is communicated to the viewer. Photographing images up close also change their perspective on how they are with respect to the rest of the landscape. And the one on the left here are some tiny blossoms, but when they're photographed against the sky, they look massive, because we know the sky is massive and they're bigger. So just how you put in your image relative subjects within your image, you can make their size disproportionate and also add a level of interest. We can also communicate scale via our lens choice, and things in the foreground, if we use a wide angle lens, things in the foreground become much proportionally larger. It really accentuates that 3D effect. And you can see this image on the right, which is a small pier at Lake Wendouree, and the swans in the front are twice the size of the person in the back. So it immediately gives us this sense of scale, and the leading lines of the pier again give us a sense of depth in this image, and the person at the end allows us to rest our eye on something. So all of these elements have come together to contribute to the narrative of this image. And I actually went there to photograph the sunset. That was as much as the sunset provided colour on that evening. But you can see as I've told you before, a sunset is merely a background. You have to try and get things in the foreground and midground in order to make the sunset the background. And so that's what I was trying to do with the image on the right. And the image on the left, I was trying to communicate the scale. This is a courtyard within a palace, an ex-palace within Iran. And I was trying to communicate the scale and being able to do that by using a wide angle lens. And you can see the pot plants at the front. We know what the size of they are. And so you can see the depth, because the background windows are almost the same size as the pot plant. So huge courtyards they had in Iran. And again, by using a wide angle lens, being able to show the absolute mammoth scale of the Blue Mountains and communicating that scale to the viewer, because the lens gives that 3D effect of giving you foreground, midground and background. Leading lines also provide a depth. And so we've talked about leading lines contributing to the aesthetics of your image and contributing to the visual path through your image. And in this case, it shows you, it enables us, use the people as reference objects, but also given the leading lines so that you see the two people at the front on the left-hand side and then see those people in the background. So you immediately get a sense of this, the scale of this monument in Egypt. And this is on a much, the one on the right's on a much smaller level, but we've still got the leading lines and we've still got the reference people to give you a path, a visual path through this image. So that's about using reference objects, a vantage point, and your lens and leading lines to contribute to the visual hierarchy within your image and a visual path, and that all contributes to the narrative, the overall narrative, and the aesthetics, because we've seen that people make a human connection to people and animals within an image. So that's what I want you to think about next week, is how you include some of these things within your images to communicate. And I know a lot of you have told me that you've waited for people to walk out of the image before you've taken it. And so what I want you to do is encourage them to stay within the image. But if you don't want it to be about the people, then just try and use your exposures to make it a silhouette, and try and wait for them to be in a aesthetically pleasing place within your image and with a form that provides a silhouette. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.